Picture this. You're a medieval hunter, armed with nothing but iron-tipped spears and raw courage, facing down a 400-pound killing machine that can outrun your horse through dense forest. This isn't some romantic tale of chivalry, this is survival horror, 13th century style. The morning mist clung to the Schwarzwald like a death shroud as Heinrich of Bavaria stumbled through the undergrowth, his left arm hanging useless at his side. Blood seeped through his torn leather jerkin, each drop marking his desperate flight from a horror that defied belief. Behind him, scattered across a small clearing near a babbling stream, lay the remnants of what had been, just hours before, a confident hunting party of 4 mounted men, 3 dead hunters. His favourite destrier, a war horse worth more than most peasants would see in a lifetime, gutted and steaming in the morning air. All victims of a single boar they had foolishly cornered near that innocent-looking stream. The year was 1247 after Christ, and across the forests of Europe, wild boars were doing something that sounds almost impossible to our modern ears. They were killing more armed men than wolves, bears, and brigands combined. Think about that for a moment. These tusked demons weren't just dangerous, they were the apex predator of medieval Europe's darkest nightmares. Now, when I say 400 pounds, I want you to understand what that really means. Imagine a creature the size of a small horse, but built like a living battering ram, covered in coarse bristles that could turn aside all but the sharpest blades. These beasts could accelerate from standing still to 30 miles per hour in seconds, and unlike a charging horse, they could stop, turn, and charge again, before you could blink. But here's what made them truly terrifying. They remembered. Peasants whispered in hushed tones around winter fires that boars possessed an intelligence that bordered on supernatural. A boar that had been wounded by a particular hunter would remember that man's scent, his voice, even his walking pattern. Years later, that same boar might track down its tormentor and settle the score. It wasn't just animal instinct, it was calculated revenge. The economic devastation these creatures wreaked on medieval society is hard for us to comprehend today. One massive boar, and we're talking about specimens that could weigh as much as 5 grown men, could destroy 3 acres of carefully tended crops in a single night of rooting and wallowing. For a peasant family living on the edge of starvation, this wasn't just property damage. This was a death sentence delivered on cloven hooves. The Abbey of St. Gallen, with their meticulous record-keeping that puts modern bureaucrats to shame, documented 17 hunters killed by boars in the year 1245 alone. 17 men. Each death represented not just a human tragedy, but an economic catastrophe for the families depending on these providers. In an age where winter meant the difference between life and death, losing the man who brought home meat could doom an entire household. But here's where the story gets really interesting from a historical perspective. Noble lords across the Holy Roman Empire weren't organizing boar hunts for sport, they were military necessities. These weren't leisure activities for bored aristocrats, they were desperate attempts at pest control that carried casualty rates that would make modern military commanders blanch. Traditional hunting methods read like tactical disasters waiting to happen. The standard approach involved surrounding the beast with a circle of spearmen, essentially creating a human fence around a creature that could punch through armor plate with its tusks. Alternatively, hunters would try to run down boars with horses through dense forest terrain. Imagine chasing a freight train through a maze while riding a bicycle, and you'll get some sense of how that usually ended. The casualty rates were staggering. Contemporary chronicles suggest that nearly 1 in 3 organized boar hunts resulted in serious injuries or death among the participants. To put this in perspective, these were higher casualty rates than most medieval battles. You were statistically safer charging into combat against enemy knights than hunting a single boar. The economics were equally devastating. Outfitting a proper hunting party, horses, armor, weapons, provisions, and most importantly, compensation for the families of men who might not return cost more than most peasants would earn in 5 years of back-breaking labor. And failure didn't just mean lost investment, it meant the boar remained free to continue its nightly raids on precious crops. In the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, where reputation and prestige determined everything from marriage prospects to military alliances, Successful boar hunters earned more respect than tournament champions. Why? Because tournament fighting was sport, conducted according to established rules of chivalry. Boar hunting was war against an enemy that gave no quarter, followed no code of honor, and showed no mercy to the fallen. These creatures weren't just animals in the medieval mind. They were living embodiments of the untamed wilderness that constantly threatened to reclaim the fragile islands of civilization that humans had carved from the endless forests. Peasants left offerings of precious grain at woodland shrines, begging these forest spirits made flesh to spare their crops for just one more season. But deep in the Saxon forests, a common-born hunter named Dietrich was watching, waiting, learning, and what he was about to discover would change everything, not just about hunting, but about the very relationship between human intelligence and the natural world. The old ways were about to die, and from their ashes, something revolutionary was about to be born. Deep in the Saxon forests, where ancient oaks had stood since before Christ walked the earth, a common-born hunter named Dietrich crouched motionless in his tree perch, watching something that would change the course of history. Below him, a pack of wolves was doing the impossible. They were systematically bringing down a mighty boar through coordinated attacks that looked almost military. The year was 1271 after Christ, and Dietrich had spent 15 years of his life studying these tusked demons with the intensity of a monk studying scripture. But unlike those noble hunters who saw glory in direct confrontation, Dietrich approached boars like a military strategist studying an enemy army, and what he had discovered in those 15 years of patient observation would have shocked the courts of Europe. You see, Dietrich's obsession began with blood and death, as so many medieval stories do. He had watched his father die from a boar's tusk through the belly when he was just 12 years old. Not a quick death, mind you. Boar wounds were notorious for festering, and his father had lingered for 3 agonizing weeks before fever finally claimed him. That image, that sound of his father's final gasps, had burned itself into young Dietrich's mind like a brand. But where other men might have sought revenge through brute force, Dietrich chose a different path. He began to study his enemy with the dedication of a scholar and the patience of a saint. He learned to read the secret language of broken branches, the subtle patterns in rooting damage, the territorial markings that boars left like military dispatches for others of their kind. Working alongside an old huntsman who still remembered the pagan hunting rituals from before Christianity swept through the Germanic tribes, Dietrich discovered something remarkable. These beasts that seemed so chaotic and unpredictable actually followed patterns as precise as the movements of celestial bodies. Boars, he learned, possessed predictable escape routes. When pressed by hunters, they would always, and I mean always, break toward water. Not just any water, but specific streams and ponds they had marked as safe havens. Their legendary fury, that berserker rage that made them seem unstoppable, had limits. After 3 sustained charges, even the mightiest boar needed to rest, breathing heavily through flared nostrils, while adrenaline coursed through their massive frames. But Dietrich's true breakthrough came not from studying boars, but from watching those wolves work together in perfect coordination. Each wolf had a role. Some circled to cut off escape routes, others darted in to deliver quick bites before dancing away from slashing tusks. Still others waited patiently for the moment when exhaustion would leave the boar vulnerable, and that's when the idea struck him like lightning illuminating a dark forest. What if human hunters could replicate this coordination? What if, instead of relying on human courage and steel alone, they could harness the natural hunting instincts of dogs, but with human intelligence directing the assault? Dietrich began training dogs not to attack directly, but to harass. He created specialized packs where each dog had a specific role, like soldiers in a medieval army. Scent hounds, lean, long-nosed creatures with stamina that could shame a marathon runner, located the boar and tracked its movements through terrain where horses couldn't follow. Bay hounds, smaller but incredibly agile, surrounded the beast and exhausted it with hit-and-run tactics that drove the animal to fury without allowing it to land decisive blows. And then came the catch dogs, massive mastiffs, weighing 200 pounds of pure muscle and bone, bred specifically to seize and hold dangerous prey. These weren't pets, understand. These were living weapons, trained from puppyhood to face down creatures that could split them in half with a single tusk thrust. But Dietrich's innovations went beyond just dog breeding. He redesigned the fundamental tools of the hunt itself. The spears he crafted featured a revolutionary crossguard, a simple metal bar positioned behind the spearhead that prevented wounded boars from running up the shaft to gore their attacker. This wasn't just clever engineering, it was the difference between life and death for countless hunters. The training regimen Dietrich developed was as complex as anything you'd find in a modern military academy. Dogs learned to respond to specific horn calls, each note meaning a different command. A long, low blast meant locate and track. Sharp, staccato notes signaled surround and contain. A rising trill commanded attack and hold. The level of coordination required between hunter and hounds demanded years of practice and a bond that bordered on telepathic. When Duke Otto of Brunswick announced a grand hunt in 1289 to kill the notorious Black Devil of Thuringia, a boar that had killed 11 men and become a legend of terror throughout the region, Dietrich saw his opportunity. This particular beast had earned its fearsome reputation by developing what seemed like supernatural cunning. It had learned to recognize the sound of approaching horses from miles away, had memorized every hunting trail in a 50-mile radius, and possessed tusks as long as short swords. Previous hunting parties had tried everything. They had brought hundreds of men, the finest horses, the most expensive equipment. All had failed. Some had never returned at all, their fate marked only by blood-stained trees and scattered equipment found weeks later by terrified woodsmen. Dietrich convinced a minor lord, a man desperate enough to try anything, to let him demonstrate his method. As horrified nobles watched from a safe distance, expecting to witness yet another massacre, something unprecedented unfolded in those dark German woods. Dietrich's dogs worked in perfect synchronization, their movements orchestrated by horn calls that echoed through the forest like some ancient battle song. The scent hounds located the Black Devil within hours, tracking it to a dense thicket where it had made its lair among fallen trees and brambles. The bay hounds spread out in a careful circle, their barking and feinting attacks driving the massive boar into increasingly desperate charges that accomplished nothing but exhaustion. And when the moment came when the Black Devil stood panting and vulnerable, the catch dogs moved in with mechanical precision, while Dietrich delivered the killing thrust with his cross-guarded spear. The Black Devil of Thuringia fell in less than an hour, with no human casualties. As the nobles stared in stunned silence at the massive carcass, they realized they had just witnessed the birth of a new age. Dietrich's life was about to change forever, and with it, the face of medieval Europe itself. Within 5 years of the Black Devil's death, something extraordinary happened across medieval Europe. Dietrich's revolutionary hunting method didn't just spread, it erupted like wildfire through the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, fundamentally altering the very fabric of medieval society in ways that nobody could have predicted. Think about how quickly information travels in our modern world, then imagine the opposite. In the 13th century, news traveled at the speed of horses and the reliability of human memory. Yet somehow, word of Dietrich's success reached from the Saxon forests to the courts of France, from the mountains of Bavaria to the plains of Poland, faster than anyone thought possible. Why? Because this wasn't just a new hunting technique, this was economic revolution disguised as forest craft. Noble courts that had struggled for generations with the boar menace suddenly found themselves establishing specialized kennels, where boar hounds lived in greater luxury than most of their human subjects. We're talking about dogs that slept on straw beds, ate carefully prepared meals of barley, blood, and herbs, believed to enhance their courage, and received medical attention from trained handlers who earned more than skilled craftsmen. The breeding programs that emerged became obsessively detailed in a way that would make modern geneticists envious. The monastery of Cluny, those meticulous record keepers who documented everything from grain harvests to miraculous visions, maintained bloodline records spanning 300 years. They tracked which dogs produced the best scent hounds versus catch dogs, which bloodlines showed the most courage under pressure, even which combinations of parents created offspring with the intelligence necessary for complex horn call training. Master trainers became celebrities in their own right, earning salaries that exceeded those of knights while jealously guarding trade secrets like using piglet urine to trigger young dogs' hunting instincts, or the precise mixture of wild boar fat and honey that could create scent trails for training purposes. These men wielded influence that reached into the highest levels of medieval politics, because success in the hunt had become synonymous with political power itself. The economic transformation was immediate and profound. Successful hunts didn't just eliminate crop-destroying pests, they flooded markets with preserved boar meat, creating entirely new trade routes and establishing winter food security for regions that had lived on the edge of starvation for centuries. Boar bacon, smoked and salted using techniques perfected in monastery kitchens, became a luxury commodity that traveled hundreds of miles from forest to table. But the ripple effects went far beyond just meat production. Craftsmen developed entire industries around the hunt that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. Armorers began creating specialized protection for dogs' leather vests, reinforced with metal studs that could turn aside, glancing tusk blows. Musical instrument makers crafted hunting horns with specific tonal qualities that could carry commands across miles of dense forest. Portable field kitchens allowed hunting parties to spend days in the wilderness, turning boar hunting from desperate day-long affairs into elaborate expeditions that resembled military campaigns. The political implications proved equally revolutionary. Lords who mastered Dietrich's technique gained enormous advantages over their neighbours, both in resources and prestige. The Count of Champagne leveraged his superior hunting success into 3 advantageous marriage alliances, using his reputation as a master huntsman to convince other noble families that his bloodline carried divine favour. The Duke of Swabia used boar meat surpluses to maintain a larger standing army through winter months, feeding professional soldiers when other lords had to rely on seasonal peasant levies. Regional competitions emerged as lords sought to demonstrate their superiority through hunting prowess. These weren't casual affairs, they were state events that combined military display with economic demonstration. Foreign ambassadors were invited to witness hunts that showcased both the wealth necessary to maintain such elaborate operations and the tactical sophistication that suggested broader military capabilities. The culmination of this golden age came with the Great Hunt of Bamberg in 1321, an event that contemporaries described as surpassing even royal coronations for spectacle and significance. Coordinated teams using refined versions of Dietrich's method killed 47 boars in a single day, enough meat to feed an entire city through the harshest winter months. The logistics alone were staggering: over 200 dogs, 50 mounted hunters, and support staff that included everything from field surgeons to maintain the hounds to scribes recording every kill for posterity. But success, as any student of history knows, often breeds its own unique problems. The very effectiveness of Dietrich's technique began to create unintended consequences that nobody had anticipated. Boar populations, under sustained pressure for the first time in centuries, began exhibiting adaptive behaviors that bordered on the supernatural. They avoided traditional hunting grounds, developing new migration patterns that took them through terrain where dogs couldn't follow effectively. Some boar populations seemed to develop what we might call cultural resistance to dog harassment, teaching their young to recognize and counter specific hunting tactics. There are documented cases of boars learning to attack hunting horns directly, silencing the command structure that coordinated dog packs, or using terrain features to funnel pursuing hounds into ambush points where a single charge could eliminate multiple attackers. The vast expense of maintaining specialized hunting packs began to strain even wealthy estates. A single master hunting dog represented an investment equivalent to a war horse, and losses during hunts inevitable when facing creatures with foot-long tusks created ongoing financial pressure that forced some lords to choose between maintaining their hunting capabilities and funding other essential operations. Most significantly, the very effectiveness of the technique began reducing boar populations to levels where elaborate hunts became economically unjustifiable. Regions that had once supported dozens of hunting-worthy boars found themselves with populations so depleted that the massive investment in hounds and equipment could no longer pay for itself through successful hunts. The Golden Age was creating the seeds of its own destruction, and on the distant horizon, a new technology was approaching that would change everything once again. But that's a story for another day, because first we need to witness the last stand of the great hunt masters, and the end of an era that had transformed medieval Europe. As the 15th century dawned across medieval Europe, something ominous was stirring in the morning mists of the great forests. Chinese black powder weapons, those thunderous harbingers of a new age, had finally reached European shores. They offered something that would have seemed impossible to previous generations, a cheaper, though infinitely less honourable, alternative to the ancient art of boar hunting. The old guard of huntmasters, men who had spent decades perfecting Dietrich's revolutionary techniques, viewed these crude firearms as nothing short of an abomination. To them, these weapons severed the sacred connection between hunter and prey, reducing the noble pursuit that had shaped European society to mere butchery. These were men who could read a boar's mood from the position of its tail, who understood the subtle language of forest sounds, who had forged bonds with their hounds that transcended ordinary human-animal relationships. Master Wilhelm of Cologne represented this dying breed perfectly. At 72 years old, in 1487, he had survived more boar hunts than any man alive, his weathered hands bearing the scars of 1,000 encounters with death. He could identify individual boars by their track patterns, predict their behavior based on weather conditions, and coordinate dog packs with a precision that seemed almost mystical to younger hunters who relied increasingly on gunpowder and luck. Wilhelm's lead hound, Caesar, had become legendary in his own right. This massive catchdog had survived over 200 hunts, his scarred hide telling the story of countless battles with tusked demons. The bond between master and hound had reached that rare level where communication happened through glances and subtle gestures, where each could anticipate the other's movements with supernatural accuracy. When word spread through the Rhine Valley that a massive boar had begun terrorizing villages, killing 6 people, including 2 children whose small bodies had been found mangled beyond recognition, Wilhelm knew his moment had arrived. This wouldn't just be another hunt, this would be his final testament to the old ways, a demonstration that courage and skill could still triumph over brute force and new technology. The beast they faced defied description. Villagers spoke in whispers of a creature that stood higher than a man's waist, with tusks that gleamed like polished ivory daggers in the moonlight. It had learned to avoid the crude firearms that local militia had attempted to use against it, seeming to vanish into shadow the moment it heard the distinctive crack of gunpowder. This was an ancient evil made flesh, a throwback to the primordial forests that had once covered all of Europe. Wilhelm announced his final hunt using the old ways, no firearms, no modern conveniences, just the pure techniques that Dietrich had pioneered 3 centuries earlier. As word spread, dozens of villagers gathered to witness what many believed would be the last great hunt in the traditional style. The battle began before dawn on a frozen December morning, when winter fog clung to the forest floor like the breath of sleeping giants. Wilhelm's pack consisted of 12 hounds, each one representing years of careful breeding and training. As they entered the dark woods, following scent trails invisible to human senses, it felt like stepping backward through time to an age when such encounters shaped the destiny of kingdoms. For 3 days, the hunt raged through those frozen forests. This wasn't the quick, decisive victory that Dietrich's early successes had promised. This boar possessed a cunning that seemed almost supernatural, using terrain features to separate the pack, picking off individual dogs with calculated precision. One by one, Wilhelm's cherished hounds fell to those terrible tusks. Siegfried, who had brought down the grey wolf of Frankfurt; Brunhild, whose courage had saved Wilhelm's life on at least 6 occasions; Gunther, the finest scent hound to emerge from the Rhine Valley kennels. By the 3rd day, only Caesar remained at Wilhelm's side, both master and hound bearing wounds that would have felled lesser beings. The boar they faced was equally battered but remained defiant, its small eyes burning with intelligence and malice that spoke of forests older than human memory. The final confrontation took place in a clearing where ancient stones suggested pagan rituals from before Christianity reached the Germanic tribes. As dozens of villagers watched from the safety of surrounding trees, Caesar and the boar faced each other in a scene that seemed torn from the pages of an illuminated manuscript. What happened next would be remembered and retold around winter fires for generations. Caesar, that scarred veteran of 200 battles, launched himself at the boar's throat with the precision of a crossbow bolt. The boar's massive head swung toward the attacking hound, tusks seeking the kill that had claimed so many other dogs. But Caesar had learned from watching his packmates die. He twisted at the last moment, avoiding the deadly points while locking his powerful jaws around the boar's throat. As the two ancient enemies grappled in mortal combat, Wilhelm stepped forward with his cross-guarded spear, the same design that Dietrich had perfected centuries earlier. His thrust was perfect, finding the heart even as the boar's left tusk pierced deep into his thigh, severing arteries and dooming both hunter and prey. The great boar collapsed first, its massive body shuddering once before lying still. Caesar released his death grip and crawled to Wilhelm's side, where master and hound died within minutes of each other, their blood mingling on the frozen ground as the last witnesses to a vanishing age. The villagers who carried their bodies from that ancient clearing understood they had witnessed something profound, the end of an era that had shaped European civilization for centuries. But they couldn't have known that Wilhelm and Caesar's sacrifice represented something even more significant, the transformation of medieval hunting techniques into principles that would influence human understanding of nature itself. Dietrich's systematic approach to understanding animal behavior didn't die with the last huntmasters. Instead, it influenced the emerging Renaissance naturalists, who studied his detailed hunting manuals preserved in monastery libraries across Europe. His emphasis on patient observation over brute force helped shape early scientific methodology, while his revolutionary dog breeding programs established genetic principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for another 2 centuries. The 3-wave attack pattern that Dietrich had developed, locate, harass, and capture, found new life in military tactical manuals, where it became a fundamental principle of force multiplication that modern armies still study today. His understanding that intelligence and coordination could overcome superior physical strength influenced everything from siege warfare to diplomatic strategy. Today, in remote villages scattered across the forests of Europe, variations of Dietrich's technique still survive. Traditional boar hunting continues in places where ancient customs hold stronger sway than modern convenience, and old men still train their grandsons to read the secret language of broken branches and territorial markings. The boy who once watched his father die from a boar's tusk had created far more than just a hunting method. He had developed a new way of thinking about the relationship between human intelligence and natural instinct, between individual courage and coordinated effort, between tradition and innovation. In the end, the legacy of the medieval boar hunters extends far beyond the forests where they once stalked their tusked quarry. They helped create the intellectual framework that would eventually give birth to modern scientific observation, military tactics, and our understanding of how intelligence can triumph over brute force through careful study, patient preparation, and flawless execution. The age of the great huntmasters had ended, but their influence would echo through centuries yet to come, shaping human civilization in ways they could never have imagined as they faced down those ancient forest demons with nothing but courage, intelligence, and unshakable determination.